Hi everyone, and welcome to the March edition of the iMayCall Research and Review webinar. Thanks for joining us today. First, we're going to have a fun activity to illustrate where everybody is joining us from. So, using the indicators on the left-hand side of your screen, put an indicator as to where you are joining us from. Always a fun activity to start with. Thanks everybody again for joining us today. Before we get started, just a few announcements. The call for proposals for the iMayCall conference is due March 25th, so get your proposals in as soon as you can. I'm placing the link to apply in the chat box in just a second. There it is. Also, there are a few upcoming iMayCall webinars, and here is the link to the ones I'm going to mention in just a second. There we are. March 21st, there at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time, there is a special webinar on supporting student success in competency-based learning environments. March 25th, starting at 3 p.m. Eastern, there is a special webinar on the Next Generation Learning Challenges Wave 4 grant programs. And finally, on March 26th, there's a Teacher Talk webinar starting at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. And the topic for that webinar is The Student Speak. And now for today's presentation, which is on attendance in K12 online learning. First, I'd like to introduce our presenters for today. Mrs. Stacy Bender has been the Dean of Students at Minnesota Virtual High School for 2.5 years. Prior to that, Stacy was a teacher, guidance counselor, and truancy coordinator at Wolf Creek Online High School for 5.5 years. She spent time prior to the virtual world in the seat-based setting in Minnesota, North Dakota, Massachusetts, and Scotland. Stacy believes that the virtual world needs to help educate those outside of it and spends much of her time interpreting laws created for seat-based models and creating procedures in the virtual world to be in line with those laws. And Dr. Leanna Archambault is an assistant professor of educational technology at the Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College at Arizona State University. Dr. Archambault's research areas include teacher preparation for online and blended classrooms, as well as the nature of technological pedagogical content knowledge. Most recently, she has collaborated on the Hartwell Education Initiative to create and study a newly developed blended course called Sustainability Science for Teachers. As a former middle school English teacher, Dr. Archambault is passionate about improving education, particularly through the use of relevant and emerging technologies. Stacy and Leanna have requested that you wait to ask any questions you have until the end of their presentation. So thanks so much for cooperating on that. And now Stacy and Leanna, please take it from here. Thanks so much again for presenting for us.
Hi, my name is Stacy Bender, and I am really excited to be with you guys. I'm just going to start us off with the question, why is attendance important? And I'll pretend that it's rhetorical and then answer it. How's that? In my opinion, the apex of K-12 education is to prepare students for lifelong learning and a future that is successful, that they're employable, and that they're able to become part of the citizenship of whatever community that they're in. And we sort of see that as graduation. So in order to reach the apex, they need to earn those credits to be able to graduate, pass classes and graduation tests. In Minnesota, we call them the MCA or grad, but every state probably has something similar. Maybe you're getting rid of them with current legislation like we might be, but at the moment we have them. And in order to get to that point, attendance seems to be the important piece. Even in online education, they need to show up or log in order to get to the material that they need to be able to pass those classes, earn credits, and graduate. So I'm pretty passionate that attendance is important, whether they're in a seat-based school or in a virtual school. And that's really where we're going to start with today. As we move forward, then how do we define that and encourage it in the online setting? I'm going to hand the microphone back over to Leanna as she takes us through some research.
Thanks, Stacy. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our webinar session today. My name is Leanna Archambault, as Catherine mentioned, and I'm an assistant professor at Arizona State University. As part of this research and review webinar, we'd be remiss if we didn't take a look at the research regarding school attendance. And what's good is that, especially as it pertains to the traditional environment, there's a wealth of research showing that regular school attendance has been established as a key factor in student achievement in school settings. And more recently, attendance has been determined to be associated with better performance on state standardized tests. And so that's kind of the end-all, be-all right now. And so attendance is very significant. Research has also shown that consistent attendance is a statistically significant predictor for improved performance in school. And so and it makes sense because, you know, we want students to be present and we want them to be participating in order to be successful. So in light of the relationship between attendance and student achievement, monitoring attendance becomes an increasingly important factor in assisting students and families to improve and increase school achievement. So on the flip side of that, lack of attendance at school, and this from this research base is all focused in traditional schools, and then as we get further into this issue, Stacy will be translating this for the online environment. But just to give kind of some context, lack of attendance is an indicator of students who might be at risk and requires some intervention on the part of the school personnel to figure out what's going on, if there is a case where social services need to be involved, what is the underlying cause of the attendance problem. And it's really this chronic lack of attendance without legitimate reason is what we talk about when we talk about truancy. That's what we mean. So when we look at this topic of cyber truancy, and this is a term that actually Stacy has coined, and she and I met 2 years ago at Virtual School Symposium, and I was just fascinated by this topic. And her passion for the topic and essentially her position and what she's been able to do with Minnesota Virtual. And so I'm very excited to share this work with you. But essentially, when we say cyber truancy, if you break it down, we're talking cyber, and by that we mean online, digital, or virtual. And truancy meaning not having a legitimate excuse, being absent chronically without a legitimate excuse. And so when we look at cyber truancy, we're really talking about students who are enrolled in an online or virtual cyber program who are not logging on, who are not progressing. Essentially, they have unexcused absences, as we would call them in the traditional sense. And we want to make a caveat here that every state is different. So attendance laws and attendance policy and truancy policy in each state is different, as are different configurations of virtual schools. So we're talking in a very general sense, and then as we get further into the webinar, we're going to focus specifically on how this has played out in Minnesota specifically. So there are several possible reasons for truancy. These are just some. They tend to break down between school characteristics and then family or personal or individual characteristics. So a lot of the school climate research we would see related to either poor leadership or lack of commitment to school improvement, perhaps inexperienced administrators. There might be a high turnover of teachers or staff, there might be ill-advised policies at play. And so there are a number of factors related to school characteristics that can contribute to truancy. At the student level or the family level, certainly issues of socioeconomic status, students living in poverty, different family values or attitudes toward education can play an important part. Certainly support from the parents and parent situations, so if we have a parent who perhaps is incarcerated or is working multiple jobs and is not, may not be able to be monitoring student progress, or even cases of abuse or neglect. These are all factors that can play a part in underlying causes for students being truant. So with the significant role attendance plays in student achievement, in addition to the goal of decreasing the likelihood that students are engaged in delinquent or destructive behaviors, because if they're not in school, there is that chance or propensity that they're doing something unproductive. I will put it that way. Schools are tasked with making sure that students are physically present in the classrooms on a daily basis. And if they're not in school, then schools are responsible for taking the necessary steps to determine why that is, to determine the reason behind such truancy, and then be able to intervene to correct or attempt to correct the underlying problem. So brick and mortar schools or traditional schools, as well as virtual schools, are obligated by state law to enforce existing truancy statutes that are on the books. And it's beneficial for them to leverage state resources in order to promote student success. So obviously the most positive outcomes are when schools and families and students can come together and work on a solution that is collaborative and everyone can kind of join in, and that's when we have the most positive outcomes to address attendance and truancy problems. Unfortunately, schools are often reluctant to file truancy petitions, and this is often due to a lack of funding needed to dedicate staff or personnel to pursue truancy violations. And this is because filing paperwork on the part of students who are truant, spending time in court, dedicating staff in order to be able to do this is costly. But the cost of looking the other way can be more devastating to society. So dropouts are unprepared to enter the workforce. They use additional social services. They use the criminal justice system more often than graduates do. And this was a shocking figure to me as I was delving into this topic, is that each dropout costs the public an average of $800,000 over the course of the individual's lifetime. So the cost of not pursuing, not dedicating staff and personnel to pursue truancy violations can be, it can be greater if we're looking the other way, the cost to society. So, and this is as we look at other costs. So as adults, those who are truant, more likely to be incarcerated, to be living in poverty, to have poor physical mental health, to be working in low-paying jobs, or to be using public assistance extensively, and having children with behavior problems. So it really becomes this negative cycle that is costly as a society. And it behooves us to address these issues in order to intervene and to break the cycle. So attendance issues not dealt with can lead to this destructive cycle and of increased truancy, dropout rates, subsequent poverty, and it really is incumbent upon the school system, be it traditional school system or online schools, to intervene where possible in order to kind of break this destructive cycle and to help our students. So that gives you a kind of a very quick overview of the research related to attendance And now I'm going to turn it back over to Stacy to talk specifically about how this issue has played out in the case of Minnesota Virtual.
Thanks so much, Leanna. As Catherine mentioned in her introduction, I'm from Minnesota Virtual High School, and I'm really excited. I've been the Dean of Students now for 2 years, 3 school years, or portions of school years, and I've noticed that there are just such a variety of online schools, even within Minnesota. So I just wanted to share with you, it is covered, my land is covered in snow right now. The top left-hand corner is more likely than the rest right now. We had a late March snow, and so if anybody else is freezing like I am, welcome to winter. But just like the landscapes of Minnesota being different, our online programs have a lot of different landscapes as well. We have district schools that are offering online programs within their districts. Some of those are full-time, some of them are part-time, some of them are just using online as like flipped classroom and those different concepts. Some schools are banding together and creating consortia, and then we also have charter schools that are separate from the district schools and offering full-time diploma-bearing online programming as well as part-time and supplementing some of the work that's happening in other district schools or even other charter schools. So there's a lot of differences happening in Minnesota, but the commonality is that we're all trying to do what's best for students, and in one of those concepts is attendance, and what is it? We're really wrestling. What does it make the most sense for us to be holding students accountable? And I'm guessing by the number of people who are here today that and the 13 or more different states that that's true across the nation. So I really want to share with you what's been happening in our school, and it's somewhat representative of what's happening across the state as we're trying to work together to have a more typical concept across schools, even though there's flexibility within our own schools, and really going towards a progress-based model instead of a minutes and hours and keeping track of time that kids are sitting in seats or not. Attendance in Truancy has its own landscape as well. We have 87 different counties in Minnesota, and each county is its own entity when it comes to truancy and attendance law. The law basically says kids have to attend, and then it's up to each individual county how they address that. So some of them are punitive and work with just giving consequences out or sending kids away for a weekend camp to teach them their lesson, so to speak. And others are taking a more restorative approach where they assign a social worker or a case manager, see the whole system, the whole family system view, and what's causing students not to attend, whether that's in a seat-based setting or in an online setting, and then really providing resources to the family to be able to, as Leanna mentioned in that last slide, or the second to last slide, kind of offset the cost of what it's going to cost us in the future for students who don't finish by putting those resources into them now so that they can become, students who become adults who are giving back to the system as opposed to taking it out from it. I do have a website that we've put together to be able to manage these 87 different counties, and I'll share this link at the end. Oh, sorry, someone just told me I'm not sounding clear. I really apologize for that. I hope this is better. I'll share the link at the end, but we put together this website so that we could kind of keep all of that information together about what are the 87 counties doing and what is it that we need to do as a school, because as Minnesota Virtual High School, we have students from all 87 counties. Our model is that we have about 800 students, and there are 5 people on my staff. I have 2 attendance coordinators who just do all the clerical work of keeping track of student progress, and I'll share how we track that and what it is that we do. And then there are 2 other truancy intervention specialists who work with a specific, 9th, 10th, 11th grade or special education population, who then intervene at the first sign of truant behavior. We're really trying to make sure that we get in on that before we end up doing anything at the county level. We're trying to do interventions, calling parents, having meetings, coming up with, a plan of attack, a daily schedule, those sorts of things. Our model is based on progress, so the students are required to meet a weekly progress expectation. We have a mathematical formula that determines if students have met our expectations or not, depending if there's a staff day, which is a no school day for students. A week may only have 4 days in it as opposed to 5. We allow them to complete 5 days worth of work. The determination of what 5 days of work looks like for us just means that they're making our weekly progress expectation. That may look different in all of your schools, and so I'm happy to share more specifics with people individually, but every program is different, and I think we'd have to talk through that a little bit individually. But you can determine what does it look like for your students to have a week of attendance, and then translate that into days so that you can be working in that traditional truancy model that's based more on days and hours than it is on how much work they completed. Our students really benefit from the interventions. We're able to intervene and keep kids out of a county level intervention in about 80% of our cases. So we're really able to get in there and create interventions that are successful, and then about 20% of our population, and I'm really going anecdotally because I don't know what the numbers are this year, but about 20% of our students end up in court is what I remember from last year. Our course completion rates have been positively impacted by this. When I started at Minnesota Virtual High School a couple years ago, we had about 38% of our courses being completed, and our last semester course completion rate was sitting more at like 50%, 46 to 50%, depending on the age group. And so we're seeing a lot of positive results from putting this into place where we're tracking and intervening so that students are either becoming more successful or being counseled into a different situation, whether that's back in their seat-based district program or an ALC, Alternative Learning Center, or possibly even another online school that just has different programming. Maybe they need a project-based program model as opposed to a traditional online program. The formula that we use is 25% overall progress increase each week. So we add up a total from all their classes, how much they've completed this week versus last week, and then we do look at login time as a secondary factor only because we want to be able to see if our assumptions are correct, that it takes about 20 to 25 hours of documented online learning in our system each week to accomplish our requirement of progress increase in that week. Each of our students has their own spreadsheet that looks like this, and it looks really complicated, but the really important line in all of this is line 16, row 16, the purple highlighted one, which is that weekly increase each week. And so this is an example of a student who's on track every week, getting 25% or higher, and that 25% is a baseline based on a 60% passing with a D-. So at the end of the semester, the number that you should see for each of the classes in those columns is 60 or more in order for them to earn credit. So we just backed it up over a semester. How much should it take each student each week to get to that point? And then the purple line on all of those bottom rows are filled with formulas that are just, you know, making up the data that we need or creating the data that we need, not making it up. It's based on true fact, objective fact. But then you're able to see that the cumulative absences in the term, that bottom line, or row 18, you can see that if a student is doing what they're supposed to do or more, they're actually earning negative absences. So if a student is more on track than a D-, then they're going to have negative absences. But we want to see that purple line be 25 or higher. This is an example of a student who's not doing what we expect, and this is a student who would have been on an IEP, and that student was given only 2 classes at a time instead of a full load of 6. The Introduction to Online Learning class only takes like 4 hours and doesn't actually count into all the calculations, but we put it in there anyway just to keep track that it's there. So this student was overwhelmed by seeing 6 classes. The IEP team determined that they only needed to have 2 at a time, but the expectation then was that this student was finishing these 2 classes faster, and this student may have come in late in the semester, so instead of giving 6 classes, only got 2. You can see that, you know, right off at the beginning of weeks 15 through 17, only a few absences here and there. But then towards the end, this student just stopped doing anything, and you can see all those unexcused absences there. And again, that's all based on that purple line, whether they're at 25 or higher. So this one, the student went downhill really, really fast. And we would have actually needed to file a truancy report depending on what county that student was in. And after 15 consecutive days of non-attendance, so 15 days of unexcused absence in Minnesota, you have to withdraw the student from your program and notify the district that they actually live in, and then that district tries to pick them up and bring them back into school. This slide, I just don't want to offend the people who are from Ohio. I just found this, and it was just a great example of what happens when online schools aren't doing what non-online schools are doing. We end up with headlines like this that are inflammatory and misunderstood and written by columnists who don't understand the intricacies of online schools. And it was headlines like this that I've tried to combat over the last 7 years working in online truancy. We actually had, when I was working at Wolf Creek Online High School, we were approached by a county attorney who said, "I don't understand why you're not filing truancy on your kids. Is this something that the Department of Education needs to look into?" And we said, "Oh, no, nobody needs to look into anything. We'll just take care of it." And so that was when I basically jumped into this role, and now, spend my time, especially in Minnesota, but I'm happy to do it on a national level as well, helping online schools be able to work within those laws that don't really address what we need them to address. But we still need to be able to educate the public and help keep headlines from this from happening in our own states. And Ohio isn't the only one. This one just was the prettiest. Any program can do what I'm doing. The way that we would need to do this is just write an attendance policy that reflects your progress-based attendance. You need to create a tracking system so that you can be putting these things into place for each individual student. Implementing interventions then so that you can get in there and really change the behavior and get them on track, or else help them to be able to choose a different online setting. Try to get some baseline data so that you can compare as the years go by. How is this impacting your course completion? Is that going up? And then educating students and parents to understand why we do what we do. We also need to educate other educators. I go to conferences all the time and people don't understand what it is that I'm doing, why we're even in online, all of those kinds of things. And then in Minnesota, it's taken me 7 years to really educate our county attorneys. In your state, that might be somebody else who enforces your truancy in your state. So I encourage you to get into that, kind of get into the trenches with us and join us on that. There's a lot of policy implications. Online education is just growing, and states may have to write attendance policies that help to govern attendance and truancy in the online environment rather than just in the seat-based one. At the same time, we as virtual schools need to be establishing procedures that allow us to work within what's currently there. So I just want to ask what's happening in your state and how are people doing attendance and truancy, and I'll probably have Leanna jump in here in a minute to moderate the question and answer time. And then we'll take questions as well.
Thank you so much, Stacy and Leanna. An extremely important topic in our field, and we greatly appreciate your efforts in this area. And as Stacy said, we're going to go ahead and open questions from the audience. Please feel free to type your questions in the chat box or use the microphone to ask questions.
Hi, I'm from Ohio Virtual Academy, and we use a login system where parents, learning coaches manually log in attendance hours. So how does your school in Minnesota keep track of that?
Curriculum is actually tracking every minute, second that a student is inside the curriculum environment itself. But because we look at progress first, that really allows us to have a standardized measurement across for all students. What I found over the past 7 years is that it takes some students 5 hours to complete the same thing that it takes another student only 2 or 3 hours. And so I needed to determine what it was that was the standard measurement that I needed to look for, and that was when I went into looking at more of a progress-based learning. And I know that a lot of different research is being done right now with competency-based completion as well as progress-based completion in other online settings. So that was why we did it that way.
Thanks, Michael. Michael asks the role of parents and community-based organizations in improving attendance for blended learning environments. I certainly think, especially from a research standpoint, parents are an essential component in terms of attendance and monitoring their values for having students involved, actively involved in school, and monitoring and making sure that they are, in fact, progressing and doing the types of things and checking in on their work. In terms of blended environments, I think one of the interesting things there is the engagement on the part of the students. And so kind of depending on what resources are being used, but the students, you know, as the learning goes beyond just the confines of the traditional school day and the student becomes more engaged, I think that you would see an improvement in attendance as the learning is more relevant and individualized for that particular student. And I think certainly community-based organizations that can offer access for those that might have, you know, those that might be in impoverished areas and need a place to go in order to log on and kind of have access to the technology, they could also play an important role in improving attendance in blended learning environments.
Kristen, I just saw your question about the difference between those students who are full-time and those students who are part-time. We actually track them similarly, but we report them differently. So we still have that expectation that they're making the progress weekly, but then we just report that back to the student or to the district where the student is registered as a full-time student and allow their school to determine if this is in line with their attendance policy or not. And then, Beth, your question about academic integrity issues, there's a couple of different things that alert us. The teachers really get to know students and the kind of work that they're typically doing. So the writing assignments, those projects, that kind of thing is one of the alert areas. So if it suddenly looks much better or much worse than what the teacher is typically seeing, that would alert the teacher then to kind of dig into that a little bit. But too little time is definitely one of the things that can alert us. I have a student who all of first semester was taking tons of time and never turning anything in, and 2 weeks before we were going to court, all of a sudden he was doing really, really well. And so our principal did, call his family up and say, we need to have a meeting, and it did turn out that his dad was going in there and doing some work because he was afraid of what a judge might say or do. So that definitely does help us in that. I see there's also another question about educating the different county attorneys about online schools and truancy and attendance in Minnesota. Where that came from, or how that came about for me, started with it was Chisago County was where I was. Not that that means anything to most of you, but the county attorney there was really more interested in helping students and was wondering why our school wasn't reporting truancy to them so that they could get those students the social work needs or social work supports that she saw them as entitled to. And so we then started working with her, and then through her contacts with other county attorneys, she started talking about online schools. There were some county attorneys that had, I guess, been making some noise at the Capitol about online schools, and through my contact with the Chisago County attorney, we were able to kind of do an email blast out that, you know, here's Stacy and she's developed this, and how can we educate you and help you, and what is it that you need from us? So that whole spreadsheet has been developed over the past 2 years since I moved over to Minnesota Virtual High School, which is much bigger than my Wolf Creek Online student population and many more counties. And so every element that's on the spreadsheet that I created has an element that one or more counties have needed, whether that's parent information, intervention tracking, student progress, obviously in days, but then even something as simple as their Minnesota identification number. And so we've worked with them, and I always start off the conversation, we want to do what's best for students in your county. What is it that you need from us? And it really disarms them completely when I say things like, you and I have the same goal here, which is students becoming successful adults. So how can we partner together with that? And more, you know, those who have been sort of animus towards online schools suddenly aren't that way anymore.
I saw Roger's comment about, yes, a student can definitely be logged in and doing something else. So I think that's important in consideration as to why Stacy was talking about using that time, that login time, as a secondary measure, and really looking at the progress model and what are the progress of the assignments that they're making, and being able to equate that to absences. And the other thing is, too, I've run into this with my own undergraduate students. And interestingly enough, when I look at the tracking, I can see where you can set, at least with our system, you can set some unusual number like 27 minutes. And when I see 27 minutes that it would time them out after a certain number of minutes. And I can kind of look for that unique number, and more times than not, it's probably that they were logged in but not really doing any activity. So just thought I would share that aspect. Crystal asks, what are some instructor best practices within the virtual classroom to improve attendance in a state where there are no cyber truancy laws? And I think that this is an important clarification. As far as I know, as far as I'm aware, we're talking specifically about a way that we can translate attendance in the online environment in order to use the existing attendance laws. So I don't know of any cyber truancy laws on the books. We're equating time and progress in the online environment in order to be able to track attendance. And be able to report that to the court system when necessary. I think monitoring student progress and keeping on track when you have a student who's really has fallen off, and as a teacher being aware, and I think this is an instructional practice that is indicative of a good teacher in a traditional environment. If you have someone who's kind of falling behind, you want to certainly intervene. And I think that virtual schools too, Minnesota Virtual, I think, is ahead of its time in creating a dean of students, and that's Stacy's role, that she's a full-time person in addition to, I believe, Stacy, you have 2 assistants or support staff that help you. And at any rate, allocating personnel in order to be able to track what's going on and to intervene early, so that we can try strategies, kind of the least intervention, see what we can do, but then used a lot if necessary. But it's that tracking and realizing that there's a problem and identifying the problem in order to be able to step in. And Stacey, if you have anything to add, that would be great.
Yeah, at our school, we get weekly spreadsheets that are color-coded. So if a student's in the red, then we generally put them on a success plan. We meet with the student and the learning coach, put them on a success plan for a week or two and see what happens. If they don't follow through, then we've got a family success liaison who contacts them. They work with them for a couple of weeks before we even, if they don't follow through, a truancy warning letter goes out. That often gets their attention and gets them back on track.
Roger, that sounds great. I did want to clarify with you, Roger. You said the Ohio requires 920 hours per year. Is that specific to online students, or is that a generic number that applies to all students, whether they're seat-based or online?
Yeah, in brick and mortar schools, it's based on days of attendance, I believe, but that may be just for online schools. But yeah, that 920 hours is for our school, and that's based on learning coaches logging in to the system and logging. It's sort of an honor system is really the way it works for us.
Wow. Thanks for the question. I believe that was from Catherine about the different approaches that the different counties take. They really do vary. It's kind of amazing. I'll tell you some of my extremes. Koochiching County ordered one of my students to be in foster care from 9 a.m. till 3 p.m. every day because his mom could not get him to do his online coursework, but they felt that a foster parent could, and so he was ordered into foster care for 6 hours a day. I've had students ordered to do a weekend camp or community service. There's one county that orders community service for any truant student the first time they walk into the courtroom. There's nothing that's social work-based at all. There's no interventions. They just automatically, boom, get 40 hours of community service. And the interesting thing about that county is that they also order one parent to do the community service alongside of the student. So that's a very interesting difference. Hennepin County, which is one of the larger counties in Minnesota, it's where Minneapolis is located. They have a very structured scaffolding of intervention. So at the first reporting at 6 days, they require students to come to a parent group meeting. So parents and students come to this large meeting, like 400 people, who are then told what happens for students who don't graduate from high school, a lot of what Leanna was sharing with us. And then they're, sent back off to go back to school. And then if they don't go to school for 3 more days, then they're ordered to go to a student team attendance review meeting where the parents, the student, and a representative from the county attorney's office come and meet together. And at that point, they're also assigned an agency worker. And Hennepin County contracts with these different nonprofits in the county that have caseworkers who then case manage for up to 90 days. So they really are kind of putting their money where their mouth is and allowing this agency worker to spend a good 3 months, 90 school days, so a little more like 4 months of time with the family and figuring out what are the issues. Do we have chemical dependency issues? Is there a homelessness issue? Are the parents not working but looking? And does the student then need to babysit their younger siblings while mom and dad go off to work? All of those different things, and then work to rectify the situation. If that doesn't work and the caseworker isn't able to provide all of the interventions that they need, then they go into court. And at that point, they can the judge can basically say, you're over 16 and you're hopeless. We've done everything we can for you. And I mean, they never say that, but that's kind of the way it sounds. And so we're just going to be done with you, we'll dismiss you, and if you go to school, great. If you don't, oh well. If they're younger than 16, then sometimes they will remove the student from the home. Truancy in Minnesota falls under the Child in Need of Protection law, and so you can go all the way up to removal from home. If the student has mental health or chemical dependency issues that haven't been addressed in the 90 days with the agency worker, then the judge can say, okay, you need to do this. They can take away their driver's license. They could keep them from getting their driver's license till they're 18. I had one county, I have great stories, so I'm going to stop after this one, but I did have one judge that actually took or told a mom that she could either take home her daughter or her grandchild that day, because the daughter, who was truant, had a baby. And the judge said that either the daughter or the grandchild could go home, but the other one was going to foster care because somebody, needed to intervene in this situation. So some really extreme situations, and then some really great things can come out of the situation where they're, in the county interaction happens. Rob, I see your question about the research that's out there, and Leanna, I'd love for you to address this as well, but it's actually a really bleak area because online and blended learning is sort of new. Attendance is one of these areas where there just is not a lot of research that's been done, and I think that it will be a great research area. It's been fun to work with Leanna and Catherine on this, and see what's out there. Leanna or Catherine, do you want to jump in and add anything else to that?
Sure, thanks, Stacy. Yeah, Rob, I'm happy to share with everyone that we have an article accepted to the Journal of Research on Technology and Education. That's ISTE's leading journal, with myself and Catherine and Stacy as co-authors, looking at this particular issue and bringing awareness. And this is the one of the things the editor was particularly intrigued by is this topic. So I think that's where it starts. Is looking at how do we define attendance in the online environment, and I think increasingly we're going to be moving toward a competency-based approach. Much of the work that Susan has been working on, Susan Patrick, looking at progress as a measure and getting away from outdated constructs such as seat time. I think that's been the main challenge. Is online programs trying to equate to seat time, and what we're really seeing is that we need to have a new definition and how we define success, and I think that a progress model makes sense. And I was really excited to find Minnesota Virtual and to find Stacy in terms of a case study of a virtual school that's moving in this direction. So I'm looking forward to continuing this line of research, but it's very new. But we are pioneers, and it's exciting to be moving the field forward.
Thanks for the question, Catherine. The approaches that we take are as varied as our students are. The two other people who work with me have created individualized to-do lists that are weekly, monthly, daily for students, and will completely change that up as students are completing or not completing in compliance with what we suggest for them. We've had to go out to their houses to find them sometimes. I mean, sometimes just finding them is hard. We've done some things where we text kids to wake them up or call them to wake them up. Sometimes that's just the issue. There's talk, and I'm really hopeful that this is going to happen, that we'll be moving out of a completely virtual model and allowing for some blended time, or at least accessibility to us, where students could come in. That being said, International Falls to Minneapolis is a 6-hour drive. And so our students who are outside of the metro area are not going to have that kind of accessibility to us, but over half of our students are within an hour of a location that we are looking at to have open to students, which is really interesting because over the last couple of years, as I've watched the different INACOL white papers come out and even what's being presented at the conferences, it looks like that is, the direction that all of the online schools need to be considering is how can we add a face and a person to our online situation and really allowing students to be able to come in and meet with that person, and maybe that's all that they really need is just to meet with them, or maybe they need to sit down and get help with the math. We do have a paraprofessional who works with our special education population, and that has been just an awesome model where that person's reaching out to students, and I have fewer truant students. I have fewer students who come to us as non-truants that become truants. I'm not saying that right. Fewer students become truant with us than students who show up as truants, because we have a lot of students in Minnesota who think they can come to an online school and then basically become, a Harvard fugitive in our online setting, and they're finding that that's just not the case. So in the special ed population where we have that additional person who's able to reach out to students and spend time with them and helping them, that really is a model that's been good. So I think that hybrid is going to make a difference. I had fewer students who were truant when I was at Wolf Creek Online High School, and they are open 2 days a week with 2 large computer labs and all of their staff people available. And they have a smaller radius from which they draw, whereas the school I'm at now draws from the whole state. Wolf Creek could draw from the whole state, but they tend not to because students do want to come in. They choose Wolf Creek so that they can go in 2 days a week and get that help.
Thanks so much, Stacy, for providing that information. So we probably have about 7 minutes until the end of the webinar. I just wanted to place the evaluation link at the in the chat box real quick. But we do have time for a couple more questions if anybody would like to take the mic or put their question into the chat box. It doesn't sound like we have many more questions, so I would like to take this time to, just kidding, here's Beth. What are teachers' responsibilities in showing truancy, or is it all computer-based?
In our model, Beth, it is all based on the progress that they make, so it's all based on the work that students turn in. We will go to teachers and say, I need your help to intervene. And I would love for teachers to take a little bit more responsibility in preventing truancy completely, but that's something that we're moving towards. Historically, Minnesota Virtual High School has been a school that we're open and we're available. We actually have staff 24 hours a day available to students via phone and chat. So we're open all the time, and because of that, I think sometimes the teachers feel like they don't have to do as much reach out because they're available. But just because someone's available doesn't always mean that someone's going to come to them. And so we're moving towards having teachers take more responsibility, maybe assigning them kids or asking them to be a little bit more reach out in that. And I think that will add to it. In other programs in Minnesota, there are more responsibilities for teachers to be reaching out to their students and staying on top of them. What we've done is we've had those truancy intervention specialists become kind of that mediator of that. But because our model is progress-based, we don't put anything directly on the teachers. Depending on your model, though, that could very easily be a responsibility that your teachers have. So I'd be happy to talk to you specifically about your program if you wanted to at some point. Okay, I'm just trying to stifle a giggle because that's a great question, Catherine. The most rewarding part of my role is to be able to see a student come in with truancy from a previous school, a seat-based school typically, and then have a judge tell me, well, we'll give you 6 weeks, and if they're not doing well at your school, then I'm ordering back to their school. And then to see that student just take that challenge and really turn it around and become a great online student. And to just be able to say, my truancy was based on a setting that wasn't right for me, whether that was due to, chronic illness or a bullying situation or any of those kinds of things. Seat-based settings just aren't for everyone, and online can alleviate a lot of what was going on in those seat-based settings and then creating the truant behavior. So that's really cool when I get to see that. The challenge for me is that, and this is completely anecdotal, but my observation is that truant students in online tend to have really uninvolved parents. And I think that that's true, and there's probably tons of research out there that Leanna could speak to, that truant students tend to have uninvolved parents. But I really see it in our 15 and older students where the parents are just like, well, there's nothing I can do. This is kind of the last stop, and if they're not going to get their act together, I'll just sign them out of school and they can be a dropout. And I have a really hard time with that. I really do believe that high school diploma is a very important start for all of us. And if that's the highest education that we achieve, we've still achieved that. And it's a great starting point for successful and beneficial lives. And it's very hard. Some parts of Minnesota are very anti-education. They just don't think it's that important still. And that is very challenging to me.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Stacy. You can definitely tell by the way that you're talking about it how passionate you are about your role in supporting students. So we're close to ending here. I'm going to go ahead and post the evaluation again in the chat box. If you do have extra questions for Leanna or Stacy, their email addresses are right there. Stacy and Leanna, if you could go ahead and post the email addresses in the chat box as well, that would be great. And any other resources you'd like to share with the group, that would be wonderful as well. Just paste them into the chat box. And I would like to say thank you again to everyone for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your Tuesday afternoon. Thanks so much.